in both local and state politics. So
it has. So obviously we start the show off every week with listener questions, something that we've recently jumped into. Really interesting. Some really interesting ones came in this week. And actually, we are also launching this week our own email address for questions to come in beyond social media. That's debrief@fingerlakes1.com. That's DEBRIEF. It was like we were trying to think of what it should be. We didn't want it to be too complicated. We didn't want to put podcast in it.
Yeah.
Because that would just confuse people.
That looks good.
Debrief.
Yep.
So get your questions in, people. So question number 1 comes from Aaron, who I assume is from Geneva. We got that email. I forwarded it to you, and I'm not really sure. It was about the actual function of the mayor. So she asked, what does the mayor of Geneva actually do? Aaron adds that she's an avid follower of politics, but that sometimes it appears that the city manager or councilor at large wield more power than the mayor does. She asks, is that my perception or is that reality?
Well, I guess those are two different questions, right? Like, how should it function and how does it function? So I think anybody who's been watching local government for the past 10, 15, 20 years in Geneva would say that the city manager is the person ultimately who sets the agenda, both literally in terms of writing the agenda and figuratively in terms of determining what gets talked about and what gets done. But that's not the way it should be. I mean, we've frequently talked about that being an inversion of the power structure. The city manager is supposed to be akin to a CEO of a board of directors, where the board of directors set the policy, they set the priorities, they have a work plan, and then their staff people carry it out, and the CEO directs those staff people. That is just not the way it goes in Geneva. Part of that, I think, is because elected officials are part-time, and I think sometimes that leads people to think that in between meetings there isn't really anything they need to do, even though there clearly is stuff that needs to be done. I also think it's that you've had city managers, for good or bad, who have enjoyed having the leeway to set the policy. And I think that was more pronounced in the early years, where there was more cause for concern that city managers were steering the city in the direction they found most favorable. And then with Matt, I think there was more of a mix. I think people felt like, yeah, he was setting the agenda, but in general, it was in line with the agenda that people would set if they just normally cared about the community anyway. So it wasn't as big of a deal for people. Does that answer the question? What's the mayor supposed to? I mean, so the mayor's supposed to head that up. The mayor's supposed to have policies and agendas and a purpose, vision for where the city's going, and then they're supposed to put that forward. But
yeah, and I think that what kind of, and this is just my perception, it seems to be that the roles, the technical roles of elected officials across the board in communities large and small, gets a little bit gray, a little bit confused sometimes when you have these different forces at play, when you have these different entities at play. So a city is completely different than a village. It's completely different than a town. It's completely different than a county. And you have all these different formats, essentially. It's like you have to learn, it's a textbook for each one. So that's kind of I always kind of remind people, it's, the more meetings you go to, you're going to get a pulse for what that particular board does or how they act in particular. That does not necessarily mean that's how they're supposed to act, or that is how it's supposed to flow, the power structure and whatnot. Anyway, another interesting question in the same sort of realm, and the reason why I took it in was because I heard it and I thought it kind of ranked similar to this one, and I thought you'd actually get a kick out of it. Dwayne from Seneca Falls asks, why don't towns have wards or zones like cities or villages. When I have a question or concern, I often call multiple counselors who are elected at large, and often the individuals who represent our town don't represent all of the neighborhoods. And I had a couple weeks prior, I had been doing some digging into that, what the threshold is and whatnot. So there's two different classifications of towns. There's basically a Class A and a Class B, call it that.
Okay.
It's driven by population. If your population is north of 10,000 people, you can actually go through the legislative process and have wards. If you are not, your councilors are elected at large. And if you want to go through the process to become a Class A town, you can do that, but you have to pass basically its own resolution, local law, first adopting that status, which requires a referendum vote.
Oh,
and
okay.
then the following election cycle, you could basically run through the same procedure: resolution, local law, referendum, to have a scenario where wards or zones, whatever you want to call them, are drawn up. But the interesting thing that I found is I believe there's around 15 towns in New York State that have these wards, if you want to call them that. And oftentimes when they are voted down by the voters, when they're actually put on the ballot, because you think to yourself, well, that's just giving that's just giving the residents, taxpayers, voters more power. Why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they
Right.
want that? As it turns out, the process plays out such that you don't know how the map is going to be drawn until after the vote happens.
Okay.
And that is typically one of the big reasons why people steer away from it or say no to it when it's put on the back of the ballot.
Right. That's really interesting. I mean, I have learned something. I didn't know that. In the city of Geneva, the ward lines have not been redrawn for. I am not aware of an update to the ward descriptions past like 1965, which actually is not the way it's supposed to be. The wards are supposed to be redrawn as soon as practicable after every decennial census. And, while I was on council, we went through two of those and did not redraw the ward lines after either of them. And I think part of that is, I don't want to say it's gerrymandering because that doesn't really happen on a local level
Right.
as much. But I think that there is a concern that in general people look at the way legislative districts are drawn, congressional districts, and they think we're not getting into that. We don't want to mess around with people trying to protect their own seats and create pockets of voters that are one party or another. So yeah, the lines in Geneva have stayed the way they are, and I think that having ward representation is helpful, especially in a city like Geneva, because if they were just at-large council people, you might find people getting elected from just one area of the city, and then you'd have to ask, like the person who wrote in, whether or not everybody's getting represented. If you're not living in a particular area, are you taking those concerns as seriously? I mean, you would hope people would. If you're elected at large, you're supposed to be equally concerned. So Geneva has that balance of having 6 wards, 2 at-large council people, and then a mayor who represents the whole city as well. So the idea is you have both.
I think that you might have just tapped in on part of the frustration. When the village of Seneca Falls dissolved, there were 4 wards, and in acquiring the entire ring around that, which is the town of Seneca Falls, the talk on the street seems to be at this point that those folks don't feel quite equally represented to
Right.
those who live in the former 4 wards. So, I mean, in theory, it would be really interesting. And, funny enough, when you're going through that process, that legislative referendum process that I was talking about, you can actually increase the number of counselors that you have on the board as well.
Yeah.
So it's something that I think a lot of people would probably just assume can't be done. is actually all fair game to be changed if you have the legislative will and the will of the constituents.
Yeah, and I would think that in Seneca Falls in particular, there would be an interest in doing that because, I mean, I think about the way it works in Geneva and I think, okay, I was the first ward counselor for a long period of time, and that's the ward that includes the colleges. And I know that some of the concerns and issues related to being a college neighborhood are much different and wouldn't even be on the radar screen of somebody in like Ward 3, which is primarily single-family homes. So I think that having the ward distribution is supposed to, like, for example, the 4th ward includes the hospital. That has a separate set of considerations in both terms of land use and services than other wards. So I'm surprised that in Seneca Falls there isn't like a district that is kind of landfill impact zone A, B, C, kind of in a radius from the landfill.
It is interesting because I do think that, you talk about what the different folks around Seneca Falls sort of feel and live on a daily basis. And it's funny, like even in a small community like Seneca Falls, there is quite a bit of nuance built into what people care about in one part as opposed to another. Like in Geneva, you can totally understand where you have a large college for this area.
Right.
And then you have super residential, you have some more, like, I don't want to call them rural, but you have a little more disconnected places. And then you have more traditional downtown settings, urban. It's just, there's a spread.
Right.
And I think people probably, in terms of, representation, I'm not really sure where I was going with that, but essentially, you want an equal spread of representation.
And you want to ensure that you have diversity in viewpoints and perspectives, because if what you're saying is that even in Seneca Falls there are these nuances, I mean, better decisions are made when you are looking at an issue from multiple angles.
And I suddenly remember where I was going with that. It's also easier. If you are responsible for Ward 1, those are the folks you are responsible to. You obviously have a responsibility to the entire community, but you can focus on the issues that are happening in Ward 1.
Right.
And that's kind of I think that's kind of the logic behind it. You get more, I don't want to call it specialized effort out of the board members individually, but focus. And in something that can be very daunting, like being in a town councilor, you aren't getting paid that much, and it can feel very daunting.
Well, and I guess what I would say is that if a community didn't want to go through the process of trying to develop wards, another way to achieve a similar objective, it's not identical, but a similar objective, and something that even the city of Geneva with a ward structure I still think should adopt, is a committee structure. A committee structure that allows council people to, I'm not going to say they're going to become specialists, right? But the idea is to at least have some enhanced knowledge, some enhanced access to information. Because, the cliche holds, jack of all trades, master of none, right? So if you're expecting every one of your council people to be a generalist and know a little bit about everything, then when you've got to tackle a big complex issue, you're just dealing with a bunch of people that only know a little bit about it. And that does not seem preferable to having at least a couple people who know a lot about that topic and can help, not that they get the final say, but they can help describe it in a way that's more relevant.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Our next question comes from Mark in Newark, who asks, is public transportation being taken seriously enough here in the Finger Lakes? I've seen a lot of talk about it in the region, but it all seems to be individualized efforts rather than a collective one that might be more effective in the long term. It's interesting because I agree with you, Mark. We see a lot of it in the headlines. You see Yates Transit doing this, or Ontario County making a move on this, or Seneca County spending some money here, but you don't see that sort of collective effort that probably would be more effective because, looking at it from if you need to go to the doctor's office, you may not go to a doctor in Seneca County if you live in Seneca County.
Right.
And does a Seneca County transportation solution alone work in that setting where you have to cross bounds?
Right.
without more working together.
I mean, I am for regional collaboration all the way around, and I think transportation is no different. I mean, nobody would look at the Finger Lakes and say, wow, that is a set of robust public transportation offerings. No, that is not the case. That doesn't exist. So, yeah, I definitely think there's room for more collaboration and more emphasis on that. I think society as a whole is moving more towards collective public transportation as opposed to this individualized, everybody's got to have 4 cars in their driveway kind of. Thankfully, I think it's moving in that direction.
And finally, our last question, which is interesting because I think we were batting around this idea as a topic anyway, from Emily in Waterloo, who asked, does Cynthia Nixon have a real chance in a primary against Governor Cuomo? We both just go completely silent. Dead air. Just dead air. Emily, that sums up your question.
Here's the thing. Zephyr Teachout is her campaign treasurer or director. She's on her campaign staff. Yep. And I don't understand why Zephyr Teachout herself is not the candidate. She had an exceptional showing in the primary up against Cuomo at a time when he was far less vulnerable than he is now. I mean, we'll talk later about these convictions, these corruption, bribery scandals. Not against him, right? I don't want to get sued. Not against Governor Cuomo, but in his administration and in state government in general. I think he's a lot more vulnerable now. So I'm kind of surprised that that we are not seeing reprisal of that role by Zephyr Teachout. But do I think Cynthia Nixon has a shot? I guess it's too early to tell. I have to admit I might be having a little bit of television fatigue in terms of elected officials coming from the entertainment realm. I don't find government to be particularly entertaining or a place where entertainment is the primary skill. I worry that the more people that are coming from entertainment into government, the more of this kind of sound bite governing we get instead of serious discussions. But that said, I mean, we don't know.
Is this, so my 2 things. One, I don't think she stands a chance.
Okay.
I saw the Siena poll that came out last week.
Oh, I didn't see that.
The numbers were not favorable. I think it was like it was like a 60-20 favorability split. There's just, I don't think the support is there, especially when you look at the upstate disconnect. There are a lot of folks upstate who severely dislike Governor Cuomo, but I think the prospect of a Cynthia Nixon governorship is much more concerning to upstate folks than 4 more years of Cuomo.
Well, I think that her strategy clearly is to win the New York City vote, because her announcement was really heavily focused on fixing the New York City subway system. So right. I agree with you. I mean, that's basically like writing off upstate in general, because you're not going to motivate a lot of upstate voters to get to the polls with promises of fixing the New York City subway system. And,
and my other question was, well, how much of this is like legit campaign and how much of this is just, an effort to move Cuomo further to the left?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would hope that anybody who decides to run for public office is not running simply to get the job themselves. I hope that it's a 2-part thing, that anyone who's running for public office wants to, A, be in the position because they think they have something to offer, but B, to elevate the discussion and focus on issues they don't think are getting good attention so that government in general gets better whether they win or not. So, yeah, I hope that's part of her strategy and her agenda, is to shed light on stuff that she thinks that the governor is missing, in the hopes that if she's not successful, he becomes more successful in terms of governing.
All right. So now finally, after 20 minutes of questions, which
I love the questions.
Which I think is great.
It's great.
It's a great consumable format, and we're answering questions that people actually have. First topic of the day. This was something I think you mentioned on our last podcast.
Oh, yeah.
So MCC was criticized heavily.
Yes.
For their response. And I guess just sort of run through what you had talked about before.
Okay.
How it sort of came to be, and then we'll sort of jump into the discussion on it.
Okay, so in the wake of the Parkland, Florida school shooting, a lot of institutions of various sizes, higher education, secondary education, elementary school, have started doing these shelter-in-place drills, which is what they call them, but they are active shooter drills, right? The idea is that's what they're preparing for. And this is the alert that they sent out. Brighton campus is on lockdown. Seek cover immediately. Await further instructions. They were supposed to indicate that it was just a drill. And it actually took them 7 minutes to send this out, that MCC is conducting a lockdown drill. This is only a drill. All clear, resume normal operations. And I think, as I said last time, which I'm going to repeat because I thought it was probably the best way to describe it, if you ever wake up in the middle of the night and you hear something downstairs that sounds like you're afraid somebody's in your house, if I were to tell you it's going to take 7 minutes for you to find out whether that's true or not, you would understand how big of a mistake this was for them to make. 7 minutes, I've heard, there was an entire... We keep plugging Evan Dawson's Connections show. He does an excellent job. Right. He did an entire show with people who were at the campus when it happened, who described chaos, people screaming, crying, locking themselves in closets, trying to take cover. You can just imagine what ensues when you tell people you're in lockdown and somebody says, yeah, I hear this is an active shooter thing. Well, it spreads like wildfire. So there was a lot of apologizing that happened afterward, and then it started a conversation about whether or not these drills actually serve any useful purpose at all anyway. Yeah. And
so that is the question.
Right.
So, on the personal side, my girlfriend is a student there. That is the campus she goes to on a daily basis. That day, she was not there. She was actually working at the hospital at Strong. But there were classmates of hers who were actually in the classroom she ordinarily would have been in at the time. And the reaction wasn't like was described on some of the local news outlets. There wasn't the pandemonium. There wasn't in that particular setting. But you hear from other students, and that clearly was the reaction in some ways. And the thing that really concerned me about this whole discussion was people actually suggesting that maybe they should be surprised. So maybe they should be unplanned, unannounced. Maybe they should look like this. So that people actually take them seriously. Right. I don't know. To me, I think that's crazy. That's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, and how many times can you cry wolf and then people find out it's a drill? You don't want to practice tricking people. All that does is prepare people to be desensitized to an alert. So I actually am not sure. What would be interesting to know, and I don't think this is something MCC would be forthcoming with, or any institution, just for a variety of reasons, probably related to liability. It would be interesting to know if they felt they learned something useful about their actual response. So was there anything that came out of this drill that caused them to say, yes, we are well prepared, or no, we need to train people to do X, Y, and Z? And I don't think that's clear. So if you can't measure a benefit from your actions, maybe that's not the right thing to be doing.
I agree. I agree. And I just think that it's something that you need to have a strong policy in place. You need to follow that procedure every single time you have an event like this,
Right.
it is typical practice for MCC to clearly, note that it is a drill. It is not a real thing. So I think, just stick to the policy you have.
Right.
Don't get into the weeds on these discussions about, it's like this is the world we live in now, where there are people out there who actually think that shocking people into action is the right thing to do. That just it's
well, and I mean, think about it now. What if we were in a situation where there was concealed carry allowed on college campuses, right? Can you imagine if you run a drill like this, you don't tell people it's a drill, and you've got a couple of people who are thinking, this is my shot to intervene in this, serious issue, and they're running out into the halls, guns drawn, and it's just a drill? I mean, I don't know. That to me seemed scary. Like, you can't take a chance. I mean, what if someone got scared, they had a heart attack? I mean, there's so much that it just seems like a bad idea. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. It's just one of those really weird things. It's one of those things that, frankly, I don't even think we should be dealing with. There should be a policy for it. You follow that policy, and
right.
It's not even a discussion. But something that is worth discussing, Route 96. So there has been this sort of long-standing frustration with the traffic jam that just seems to be constantly happening on State Route 96 in Victor.
Right.
Most people understand that, if you're going to go through Victor on 96, from that just when you enter the town, the village, through, say, roughly the Eastview Mall area, you're going to be going slow, right? Like, that's just kind of the expectation. But Victor now appears to be moving toward a solution, kind of, I guess. A couple weeks ago, I had Victor Supervisor Jack Marin in, and he said that the prevailing option right now, which is it's all still in the discussion phase, so that's why it's not like there's anything concrete. But this is essentially what you're seeing on the screen right now, is the rough idea of what would be happening. So where the railroad currently sits, a byway would exist. Now you have some reservations about this or the process.
Both, I guess. So the thing about what Victor is experiencing is the effect of years of lopsided and short-term planning. Anybody who saw the development going up in and around Victor could have foreseen this issue, the traffic issue, but rather than attempting to rebalance housing and commercial use patterns, they already knew they had an active market, a captive market, so they could have really reoriented their town thoroughfares in a different way. They kind of doubled down on this suburban approach, and now this is what happens. So it's really not a surprise. What's concerning to me is that they're going to take an abandoned rail line, which in a lot of communities, the idea of using abandoned rail lines and trying to make them multi-use paths and giving people more access to green space and active recreation and active transportation, right? Making a commuting route for a kind of multimodal approach is going the way of the cars, right? The idea is that cars are king. We were just talking about public transportation, right? Instead of trying to come up with a solution that recognizes that you have thousands of people all going in the same direction, why don't we make that more efficient? Instead, it's just, let's just gobble up more street, more area for pavement. And I just, frankly, I find it short-sighted. What's concerning to me is that state dollars are going to go into this project, And I think if you look at the infrastructure needs across New York State, especially when we had that bridge report that we talked about a while ago, the idea that a suburban upper income thoroughfare, which again is the result of planning gone wrong, would soak up transportation infrastructure dollars from communities that are already struggling just to make minimum upgrades, not even upgrades, but just basic maintenance, seems unfair, seems unjust. I'm not sure that the state tax dollars collected from Cayuga and Seneca County with their list of failing bridges should be funneled to the Rochester suburbs, where the taxes, the tax base is growing. I think if Victor wants to do this, then the property taxes should pay for it and not our state dollars.
Yeah, I mean, you're making solid arguments, and I feel like they're the sensible arguments to make. But at this point, it's a problem that can't be ignored. And I think the reason why, so if you're I'm going to sit here and play devil's advocate and say, making the argument for why state dollars should be used, this is a multi-county issue now. So this is an issue that affects Monroe County as much as it does Ontario County, because it's those people who are trying to get from A to B who are ultimately having to choose between the Thruway and 96. And I'm also for, and one of the really frustrating things, people, to me anyway, people want to talk about less cars on the road. People want to talk about all these different things on that side of it, but they don't want to deal with the problem, right? Because you're not going to stop those people from actually driving their cars up and down 96 every day. Or the Thruway, maybe you can funnel some of them off. That, to me, was where the more sensible solution, if the state were going to step in and sort of fund the solution or part of the solution, I thought it would make much more sense to maybe look at lowering the cost of hopping on the Thruway between 44 and 45 instead of trying to, go through a really... And one of the things that I asked Supervisor Marin when he was here was, how do the businesses feel about it on that stretch of 96? And he said for the most part they're supportive, because that congestion also makes it very difficult to get out. And for an example, if you're on the south side of 96 and you want to turn left, good luck. Right. So, there's the benefit of it, but at the same time, those folks are going to have to live through what I would assume would be a couple years minimum of major construction. Yep. And, there's a lot of moving parts there, and they're nowhere near a complete solution. Obviously, this is, like we showed before, this is kind of the generic overview of what the leading prevailing logic is right now.
Yeah, and I think what's not shown in this diagram, though, is that, like you said, the New York State Thruway takes people from 332 to
the 490 interchange.
490 interchange. Yep. And that's what it was built for. It was built for fast transit. Right. So now you've got the town of Victor saying, well, people don't want to pay their 25 or 15 cents or whatever it is now just to go from 44 to 45. So we're going to ask the state to make us a separate road. So now you're going to have like 3 parallel tracks that you could take to get the same place. And to me, again, I just look at all the needs the state has and, budget deficits and concerns, and I think, wow, to allow wealthy suburbanites to keep gobbling up our collective resources just so that they don't have to sit in their cars as long to get to the place they want to go, boggles my mind. It seems silly. I feel like it is the fodder for a very good stand-up show. I have no skills in that, but any stand-up comedians want to take that on. I think you could do an incredibly hilarious skit about the frustrated suburbanites who need another parallel road to get to the mall.
Well, and I don't know how this would actually bear out in the numbers, but I'm sure there is some sort of environmental impact to having all of that traffic sit in the sort of main stretch of Victor, if we're talking about, those houses that are near there, the people who live in that area.
Sure.
Their environment is being impacted by it?
Sure, but you're also going to have stormwater issues related to taking a bunch of green, permeable space and turning it into solid asphalt. And it's not going to reduce the total number of cars. So you're still going to have the same kind of environmental impact in that regard. But what it certainly does is it incentivizes people to keep doing exactly what they're doing. When, if we recognize that it's a problem, we should be finding ways to incentivize a solution, not just, enabling the bad behavior.
Yeah, I agree. And as we get closer into like actual draft territory where we can talk about something concrete, something real, we'll be bringing that up again in this show, and we'll be diving into what the actual nuts and bolts are of the solution. Because one of the things, the focus is on that stretch that's actually in the I'll call it main Victor. But what people also aren't talking as much about is the actual interchange portion where 490 is. That's another big focus area of this particular plan. So it's actually a really large stretch of 96 that's going to be attacked. So jumping from one municipality in Ontario County to another here in Seneca, last night there was a public hearing held on eminent domain. Good old eminent domain. Finally, there was one held last year in May, I believe it was. Now we have this one. So it's all about this sewer line that the town of Seneca Falls would like to, in an ideal sense, lay down the Ludovico Sculpture Trail instead of upgrading the lines that currently sit on Baird Street and Fall Street. Okay. So the engineers basically say, hey, this is a no-brainer. It's not complicated. This is where we're talking about. Everybody's seen it before. It's the stretch. So engineers say, one, it's going to cost less. Two, it's just going to be an easier project. You're not going to have the different utilities to work around. You're not going to have all the trees that'll have to be removed on Baird Street. You won't have the state to deal with, which they would if they went down Fall Street. You have all these different sort of things at play. But you also have a very dedicated group of folks, including some strong legal representation for the Ludovico Sculpture Trail. I'll get that word down eventually. Who are effectively saying, whoa, hold on. Seneca Falls hasn't gone through the process correctly. They haven't sought out the right agreements. They haven't reached out appropriately to the people who ultimately own and are responsible for the trail. And, oh, by the way, you've changed your town attorney in the middle of this whole process, who, I think admittedly, from the town's perspective, the last town attorney, from their perspective, was not handling this issue appropriately. This was one of the issues that was sort of a deal breaker for the town of Seneca Falls and why they parted ways with former town attorney Pat Morrell. Obviously, that is one side of the story. That is not to cast any sort of dispersion on Mr. Morrell. That's just, the assumption, because it was one of two large legal battles that was taking place. The landfill, obviously, and then this one. So there were probably 60 to 70-ish in attendance at the public hearing. But the interesting thing I thought from last night's was that beyond the process not playing out right, and I showed you some documents right before we came on here, the resolution that essentially landed Seneca Falls as the lead agent in the secret process was passed on a day that it doesn't appear there was any actual meeting. And I took the information, and we have to do at Finger Lakes One, we're going to do a major deep dive into all of the documents that we obtained last night and throughout this past week, to sort of see where things actually bear out and what is what. But if we're going by what the town's record is of when meetings were held on their website and, when when the record seems to show that this particular resolution was passed on February 2nd, it doesn't seem to align. So that would, in my mind, while the Ludovico Sculpture Trail may seem like the best option on paper to, as far as ease of access, because I think that's ultimately what they're talking about. When they say this is the best way, right, they're saying this is the least problematic way for the engineers to go about it, because they will have much more work to do if they went down Baird Street or up Fall Street. That said, there's even been questions, the DEC pretty plainly in one of their correspondences with the town in the very early stages of this whole process said, in their opinion, the town should go up Baird Street. The town is, that's why it leads me to say that the town seems to be taking this tact where, look at that, compared to a street that probably, sees 10, 15, 20,000 cars a day.
Right.
I don't know what the actual numbers are, but that's just an estimation. It's heavily traveled.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I am not an eminent domain fan unless the project for which eminent domain is being utilized is such a pressing public good that it can't possibly happen elsewhere. And this just doesn't meet that criteria, right? Because what are they actually...
So right there, this is the actual breakdown. So utility crossings, 12 on the Ludovico Sculpture Trail compared to 171 on Baird Street.
But here's the question. So this is a stormwater or sanitary sewer line?
Sanitary.
So where are the connections to this sanitary sewer line?
It all will go up to the Balsley Road connection, the North Road. This project will essentially ensure that all of the waste being transferred from the 414 and 318 corridor will make it to the Seneca Falls wastewater treatment
Is the
plant.
414, 318 corridor a fancy way of saying Seneca Meadows?
It's Seneca Meadows, it's Del Lago,
Okay.
It will eventually be the Waterloo Premium Outlets, it will be the state police headquarters on the Thruway, it will be a number of entities. So
this is a dedicated line for those businesses, or this somehow, do any of the residents or businesses along the way tie into the line that currently exists?
That's one of the big questions that wasn't really answered that well.
Because there isn't anything on that chart that you just showed that indicated the cost to, usually, I would say, usually in projects like this, residents or businesses are responsible from the right-of-way
right
to their building, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you currently have all of those residents and businesses headed one direction and now they have to reroute to the other direction, that doesn't seem to be reflected in that. I don't know if, so that clearly would not benefit the residents and the businesses. That would not be a public interest project. But it does appear as though it's a fairly strong private interest project, looking at the benefits that the private corporations that would use it would get. I think, why can't the town of Seneca Falls just say this is where the line is and it needs to be upgraded, and if you'd like to continue tying into it, you're going to have to pay a larger portion of it.
Yeah, and we have to point out that some of the folks who turned out last night are people who live on that Baird Street River Road, and they were not one way or another all tied on the same side of the argument. There were folks there who said, and there are people in the community who live on Baird Street who are saying, I don't want my street tore up for, however long it's going to take a major project like this to happen. Right. But at the same time, if you live on Baird Street, I thought one of the interesting comments that was spoken last night that, it's going to be happening right behind you.
Right.
Along the canal.
It's not going to be.
So it's not like you're not going to notice it's happening.
Right.
Like you're going to hear the machinery, you're going to feel and see the digging, and it's going to be real.
Right.
And it's really.
Well, I guess it just goes back to this question of whether or not there's any protocol or system or logic or reason in some of these decisions. It seems like if there is going to be an eminent domain proceeding, the town board should be able to articulate to the community the standards and criteria by which they think eminent domain is warranted, and be able to give examples and a set of criterion by which they think eminent domain would not be acceptable, and then allow a discussion about which category this project fits into. Instead, you can't tailor the rules to fit the project. You have to have your rules and then do projects that fit within those rules. Otherwise, you end up eroding public trust, doing things in a haphazard and arbitrary way, and in the long run, it costs more to try to do it quickly, surreptitiously. So eminent domain, just because you can, is never the right answer. So I still have not really heard, I mean, they're saying, oh, it will be cheaper or easier, but again, I mean, there are a lot of unanswered questions just on that chart that they provided about cheaper and easier for whom. I mean, maybe the town pays less, but every individual property owner pays a lot more. I mean, there should be some cost-benefit analysis for the taxpayers.
Yeah. And, of course, our bi-weekly update on the corruption in Albany. Go ahead. Take us away. I know this is something that you wanted to chat about. So
there was a split verdict in the Percoco trial. He was convicted on the bribery. I want to make sure I'm getting the exact name of the charges correctly. He was found guilty on conspiracy to commit honest services fraud and one charge of soliciting bribes. However, he did not. He was not found guilty on extortion or conspiracy to commit extortion. So here is, I mean, I don't want to say I could care less, right? I'm glad that justice was served and that there was an acknowledgement that trading these boxes of ziti, which is the phraseology they used for the money exchanges, was wrong. On the other hand, I cannot believe that this verdict has not created a larger community conversation about ethics reform and the fact that this LLC loophole, these campaign contributions, all of this stuff continues to be just as bad. The table is set for another situation just like this. Nothing has changed. And even, you were talking before about Cynthia Nixon. Her campaign contribution.
I believe I sent that. I sent that tweet to you.
Yes, thank you. You're keeping me connected to Twitter here since I'm not on it. But yeah, it said, I don't have it, I can probably pull it up, but it said something like, she will not accept any corporate donations, but she will accept from LLCs. And I thought, man, if you're going to take Cuomo to task for something, or any member of the state legislature at this point, really, it is the LLCs. I mean, let's look at, I wrote a column about this. The judge had to stop the trial, the Percoco trial, to instruct the jurors that this LLC payment scheme that was being described was perfectly legal, so that they wouldn't be confused about what was the bribe and what was an actual campaign contribution. The fact that the judge had to do that shows the scheme is a scheme, and none of that got anybody in any trouble, but the outright bribe did. And that just still, I can't.
If you bribe within the rules.
It's so frustrating. So frustrating. And nobody, well, I won't say nobody. There have been some legislators willing to take this up, but they are quickly squashed and everybody dances around the topic. And, we're seeing it. We're seeing it in the Child Victims Act right now. Mm-hmm. Why are the Senate Republicans blocking the Child Victims Act? Because take a look at the LLC contributions and the lobbyists for this act. I mean, the amount of feedback I've gotten from that column from people who are just like, just trace the money back. You want to know why, Helmy, Nomara, these guys, Valesky, why people are not coming forward on this? Follow the money. It is poisoning our state government and has been for a long time, and someone needs to take the issue on.
Agreed.
That's just my rant, right? I say it, and then what happens? I don't know.
And that's part of the reason why I'm just kind of sitting here staring into the eyes of the camera here, because there's nothing until there's some action.
Right.
There is nothing here. We're just going to keep talking about these issues over and over again. We're going to keep, it's like the playbook. We know what the playbook is.
Right.
We know what plays they're going to run when there's 30 seconds left in the game. They run them. We talk about them. Nothing changes.
Why don't people just send, how difficult would it be if everyone just sent an email or made a phone call to their local state representative and said, close that LLC loophole. Mm-hmm. Vote for the bills that have been put forward to close the LLC loophole.
Yeah, I agree.
But people, I don't know. I mean, it can't be that people don't understand it, because it's been in the news enough in connection with Sheldon Silver, Joseph Bruno, now Percoco. I mean, people are getting convicted on things related to it, and it is the elephant in the room.
So what about, we had this broad topic planned for when public business should be conducted. So go ahead and jump into that, and then I'm going to throw a couple 2 cents in there at the end.
Well, I mean, we've been asked this before, right? How active, how engaged are elected officials really supposed to be? Especially in these local governments when it's a part-time job. When does public business actually happen? Just at the meetings? We don't want backroom deals, but what is the workload or whatever? And the March City Council meeting, I think, provided a really good jumping off point for this particular topic, because there was a counselor who at the city council meeting had this very accusatory tone toward the acting city manager, Sage Gerling, that somehow he wasn't looped into what was going on and he'd been taken by surprise by something in the newspaper. And I agree that as a general practice, city councilors should not learn from the news what city business is, right? But that's
fair.
Only a legitimate criticism if something has happened that you couldn't have had access to. That is not you can't criticize somebody else for not paying attention or not doing the work. And I thought this kind of dovetailed with this question about people who abstain from voting on the minutes when they're not present at the meeting. So Jim Meany, who I think was on your show a little while back,
yep.
Did this podcast where he analyzed the March meeting, just kind of step by step what happened. And he said something that I took issue with. I thought, no, I totally disagree with that. And he said, there is a rule, and they follow it, that if you weren't at the meeting, shouldn't vote on what was said because you weren't there. So how could you affirm that the minutes are correct because you weren't part of the meeting? But I think that's a false dilemma here for elected officials. If you miss a meeting, that doesn't mean you failed to be an elected official that month. If it does, if you really think you did nothing that month that contributes to the governing body, then please pay that month's stipend back. But it's your job, if you miss a meeting, to go listen to the audio recordings that the city clerk maintains, or to watch it when it's on television. And then you can vote on the minutes because you've seen what happened, and you can either affirm that that's an accurate reflection of what was said, or you can say, no, I'd like to amend it in some way. The idea that people are abstaining from voting because they weren't present at the meeting, to me, makes it look like public business only happens when you're actually there. And that when you go home, your job is over. And if you fail to be there, you weren't part of it. And I just don't understand that. I think that's wrong.
I mean, it's just a matter of the record. Right? I mean, that to me, it seems pretty black and white. I've never seen any examples locally. I haven't really paid that close attention to the voting record on meeting minutes in Geneva. Paid attention to a lot of things in Geneva, but never the meeting minutes. Maybe that's one of the areas. See, that's just one of the nuances that makes politics so interesting. You can have individuals take issue with something as simple and seemingly as straightforward as that. And, if there is a policy or, an unwritten rule that the councilors follow where they don't vote on it if they weren't present, doesn't that just sort of contribute to the whole disconnected, I'm not going to work with anybody else because I'm not going to take their word for it. They may not be telling me the truth. Yeah. This whole conspiracy theory breeding mess that we call our modern world now anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I used to get criticized for that. People would say, frequently, actually, I didn't miss all that many meetings, but I do remember one time being asked, how are you voting on the minutes? You weren't even here. And I said, because I went to city clerk at the time, Lori Guinan, I asked for the tape because I want to know what happened, right? I mean, there's still stuff going on. And likewise, I mean, the flip side of that is every time there's a complaint made from a city councilor that something's not happening fast enough, well, then call a special meeting. I mean, you are empowered to say this issue is top priority and this governing body is going to get together as frequently as we need to get it done. You don't yell at the staff for not doing something in the interim. I mean, they can't do everything. If you want something to happen, take the initiative. That's what an elected official is supposed to have. Baseline, qualification, initiative, enthusiasm, interest.
I agree.
Boy, I feel like I've spent a lot of this time ranting, and I apologize because that's not really...
That's okay. Rant a little more because now it's time for our stories of the week, stories to watch.
Okay.
I'll jump in quick. Mine is short, sweet, and to the point. This whole thing with Finger Lakes Health, this data breach.
Oh.
If you have a pulse and you live in this world right now, you need to pay attention to this. This is a local example of how important something even as simple as changing the password to your email account can be. Folks, I cannot stress it enough. Change those passwords every 3 months. Change it every month if you want. Because we're never going to know what the origin was. We're never going to know who it was, or we're never going to know any of those details. So this story is solely about how businesses, people, and especially when you start to look into that sort of middle range of, they aren't small businesses, but they aren't giant corporations. Those folks those businesses who fall in the middle are the ones who are absolutely most vulnerable to the types of issues that we've seen now play out in Finger Lakes Health. I mean, a company that people just automatically assume has their bases covered all the time, and this could never happen. Wrong. It can happen. It did happen. What was your news item of the week?
Mine is not local. Mine is this question about giving the death penalty to opioid distributors or large drug suppliers or dealers in general. And I guess my question, and what I would hope people would think about by the time we get to our next show, because that's when we can talk about it some more, I think, is I saw the piece on 60 Minutes. I think everybody saw that. But, they have actually identified now the two pharmaceutical companies. Their names are Miami Lucan and H.D. Smith, that supplied that town in West Virginia with 21 million opioid pills, oxycodone, and the town has 3,000 people in it. So I'm just wondering if we've said on this show before that we don't talk about the opioid epidemic enough, that no one talks about it locally enough, given the impact it has locally. I just want to ask people to think about whether even something extreme like offering the death penalty for drug dealers, like if anyone thinks that is going to fix a problem when large pharmaceutical companies are getting away with doing stuff like this.
Yeah.
Like, if you think supply is the problem, there's the supplier. There's the stream that needs to be stopped. So I guess it's just this overall question of, can you actually, like, arrest or punish your way out of an epidemic like this? I still think the answer is no. But I'm just curious. I just want to offer up for discussion that people who were celebrating, there was, coverage about local people's reaction to this. If people are celebrating this proposal, how does it fit with what's allowed to happen with no penalties, no punishment? I just don't understand it.
I agree. That'll be something that we dive into. Obviously, as we were talking before we came on here. Now, those two topics will be bumped right into our next show, and we'll be talking about those in a more in-depth fashion. But that's going to do it for this week's podcast. Thanks to our listeners, and thanks to FingerLakes1.com for making this podcast possible. Let us know what's on your mind. Drop us a line at debrief@FingerLakes1.com. For Jackie Augustine, I'm Josh Durso. Stay informed, Finger Lakes, and we'll catch you next time on The Debrief.